Welcome to Thread of Terror. We bring you the creepiest stories from Reddit. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and hit subscribe so you never miss a scare. People who work at remote places like forest officers, oil rig workers, etc. What creepy things have you noticed while at work? Story 1. Unexplained ritual.
I used to work at a public forest. One seemingly normal day, someone reported a dead animal lying on the side of one of the trails. A few of us from the front desk decided to hike out and investigate. When we arrived at the location, we were met with something deeply unsettling. It was not a dead animal, at least not one we could recognize. It looked like a giant piece of liver, maybe, just a pile of smooth red meat. Oddly enough, there was no blood anywhere around it, which made the scene feel even more unnatural. The meat was wrapped in a plain t-shirt and scattered around it were several coins. The combination of these items gave the scene an eerie, ritualistic feel. None of us could make sense of what we were looking at. Feeling increasingly uneasy, we called our rangers to come and examine it more closely. One of them arrived, took a good look, and said he was almost certain it was a placenta. That revelation sent a collective shiver down our spines. Now, here is where the situation became even stranger. To access the forest, all visitors are required to check in at the front desk. So this left us with only a few unsettling possibilities. Someone had either smuggled a placenta, or something that looked like one, into the forest. Or someone had given birth, or performed some kind of medical procedure right there on the trails. No matter which scenario was true, it was deeply disturbing. Despite our efforts to piece together the mystery, we never found out what the pile of meat really was, how it ended up there, or why it was wrapped in a t-shirt with coins scattered around it. That forest trail was never quite the same for me after that. Every time I walked down it, I felt like I was being watched, like there was some dark secret hidden in those trees that I was never meant to uncover.
Story 2. Haunting silence.
I work on North Sea oil rigs on an ad hoc basis off the coast of Scotland. While I would not say anything particularly paranormal happens, these rigs can be deeply unsettling and strange places, especially when you take a moment to truly think about your surroundings. One of the most unnerving experiences is how quickly the weather can change. Fog can roll in seemingly out of nowhere, and rigs that you can see in the distance vanish right before your eyes. Sometimes visibility drops so drastically that you cannot even see the walkway 6 feet in front of you. Walking over graded pathways becomes especially eerie. You know the sea is 60 meters below your feet, but you cannot see it. You can only hear the muffled sound of waves crashing far below, a reminder of the immense void surrounding you. What makes this fog particularly unsettling is how fast it takes over. One moment the day is perfectly clear, and within minutes, everything is engulfed in a thick, soupy mist. It is disorienting and makes the vastness of the rig feel even more claustrophobic. Then there is the rig itself. Even though it is a fixed leg platform, the structure still sways during high winds and rough seas. Feeling your office moving beneath you is deeply unnerving. You know it is supposed to be solid and immovable, yet it feels like it could tip at any moment. My last trip was my first ever night shift, and I found it particularly eerie. The plant hums with background noise, but there is an emptiness to it. I walked around the entire rig and did not see another living soul for the whole shift. Normally, there are around 130 people on board. Smaller rigs have even fewer, but that night, it felt as though I was the only one there. The silence and isolation were almost overwhelming. Once every trip, I get hit by a sudden awareness of just how isolated we are. Most rigs are an hour's helicopter ride from land, completely surrounded by the sea. If something were to go wrong, it could escalate rapidly, and help would not come quickly. That realization lingers. A constant undercurrent of tension, reminding you how small and vulnerable you really are out here. The rig is not haunted, at least not in the traditional sense, but the vast emptiness, unpredictable weather, and sheer isolation make it a place where your mind plays tricks on you. And sometimes that can be even worse than ghosts.
Story 3. The Eerie Hikers.
During college, located far away from major cities, the woods surrounded us on all sides. Among the natural attractions was the highly rated Loyal Sock Trail, approximately an hour's drive from the university. I invited a friend to join me on an extended backpacking trip, as he had never experienced one before. The trail spans over 50 miles, and we planned to hike it over a 4-day weekend. Being an Eagle Scout with extensive experience in the woods, I had undertaken numerous backpacking trips during my college years. Like many seasoned hikers, I had grown accustomed to the typical spooky occurrences. The eerie howls of coyotes, raccoons rustling at night, and the occasional unidentifiable noise. However, the most unsettling thing one can encounter in the wilderness is not wildlife, it is people. We were about 20 miles into the trail. In Pennsylvania, the underbrush and trees often obscure the trails, so I always camp about 100 meters away to avoid disturbing others or being disturbed myself. Following this practice, my friend and I found a secluded spot off the trail. This location was particularly special, a peninsula where a creek met a river. With only one way in and out, it felt secure. That evening, we started a fire, cooked our food, and relaxed. After extinguishing the fire around midnight, we retreated to our individual tents. The forest was calm, the autumn air was cool, and the moonlight illuminated the bare trees. The occasional sound of my friend shifting in his sleeping bag was the only noise, until I heard voices. The voices were too close for comfort, given the trail was over 100 meters away. I checked my watch. 3 a.m. Who hikes at that hour, especially this far into the trail? Slowly I unzipped my tent and saw my friend doing the same. He raised a finger to his lips in a be quiet gesture, then motioned toward the trail. Through the trees we saw them, 4 adults, 3 men and 1 woman, walking silently toward our campsite. They carried no flashlights, and only one of them had a backpack, an oddity for hikers this far in. As they entered our camp, they sat down by the extinguished fire pit without saying a word. Feeling uneasy, I gripped my survival knife. My friend broke the silence, asking what they were doing. Ignoring the question, they asked if we had food. I tossed one of our few spare meals to them. In quick succession, I asked why they did not use lights, if they needed help, and why they were hiking so late. Their answers were chilling. We do not use lights. We know where the trail is. It is better to hike at night. When my friend asked them to leave, they suggested we relight the fire and talk. We declined. Without further protest, they stood, gathered their things, and walked away. The rest of the night, we stayed on edge, taking turns watching to ensure they did not return. At sunrise, exhaustion overtook us, and we finally got some rest. By the afternoon, the events of the night felt surreal, almost dreamlike. The only evidence that remained was a fuzzy cap they had dropped, which I still have to this day. In the 8 years since that trip, I have never returned to the Loyal Sock Trail, nor do I intend to. That night remains the most unsettling experience I have ever had in the woods.
Story 4. Trapped in Fear.
I used to be a tutor for an elementary school where I worked with advanced students to keep them engaged and interested in reading. One day I found myself alone in a classroom with 5 third graders, hosting a small book club. The room was empty aside from us, and we were joking around, reading, and having a good time. Everything was normal. That is, until an alarm suddenly went off. An announcement crackled through the loudspeakers. There is an active shooter on campus. All students and staff must lock doors and follow active shooter protocol immediately. My heart skipped a beat. I was completely frozen for a moment, but then instinct took over. I rushed the students into a small coat closet, the only place in the room that felt like it could offer some protection. I quickly locked the door, turning off the lights to make it as dark and quiet as possible. But the panic was overwhelming. I realized, to my horror, that my phone was dead, of all times for it to die. I had no way of communicating, no way of knowing what was going on. I quickly tried to send some text to my family, trying to stay calm but also letting them know I loved them, in case something went terribly wrong. I didn't want them to be left wondering. My hands shook as I typed, and then, in a moment of dread, my phone went completely black. I had no way to reach anyone. The kids in the closet were scared too. They were trembling, holding each other, whispering. Time seemed to stretch on forever. Every little sound made us all freeze. I could hear footsteps outside the door, slow, deliberate. My breath hitched, and I prayed that whoever it was would just keep walking. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps faded, but we stayed silent. Another 30 minutes passed. I couldn't just sit there, paralyzed. My mind was racing, and finally I remembered something. Classrooms have phones. I reached for the phone on the wall, my heart pounding as I dialed the front office. "Hello, is everything okay? Should we stay locked in here? Are the police on campus?" I asked, my voice shaky. The woman on the other end of the line was calm, too calm. There was a long pause before she finally responded, as if just realizing something. "Oh, did we not make an all-clear announcement? The drill is over." A weight lifted off my shoulders, but it was replaced by something darker. The moment of fear, the panic, all of it had been a drill. But nobody had bothered to let me, an outside contractor, know about it. Nobody had told me this was part of a routine exercise. It could have been real, and I could have had no way of knowing. I hung up the phone and just sat there, stunned. I felt a mix of relief and sheer disbelief. The announcement came shortly after. The drill was over. But the terror lingered in my mind. My body was still shaking. It was a drill, but it didn't feel like one. That moment of pure fear, that feeling of being trapped with no way out, was enough to make me question how quickly panic can set in and how easily it can escalate.
Story 5. Beast of Southern Appalachia.
I'm a little late to this thread, but I hope this doesn't get buried because this story still haunts me. I worked as the county historic preservationist in southern Appalachia, managing the buildings and properties owned by the county. One of the benefits of my job was living on site at one of the historic properties. The historic house was an imposing brick mansion built in the 1810s, and I lived in a small caretaker's house about 20 feet away. This property was in the backwoods. So to deter trespassing and vandalism, the county had built an 8-foot-tall fence around the entire 5-acre parcel with barbed wire on top. I mention this just to emphasize how nearly impossible it was for anyone or anything to get past the fence and onto the property. One night, after working late at another property, I returned to my site. I pulled up to the entrance gate, let myself in, locked it behind me, and then drove the 100 yards down the gravel road to my house. There were no lights on the property, so the only illumination I had was from my headlights. As I turned my car around the corner of one of the outbuildings and parked, my headlights illuminated something that I still have a hard time describing effectively. It was the size of a deer, but with long, spindly legs and shaggy fur. It looked almost like a taller man wolf if you've ever seen pictures of one. That alone sent a chill down my spine, because there was no way something of that size should have been able to get through or over the fence. What happened next is absolutely true. I got out of my car to get a better look at what I was seeing. And as soon as I opened the door and stepped out, the creature took off running not on 4 legs, but on 2. I literally watched it raise its back up, stand to full height on its back legs, and sprint away. At that point, I completely panicked. I grabbed my flashlight and shotgun from inside the house and went to search for the creature. But there was nothing. No tracks, no signs of where it had come from or gone. It was as if it had simply vanished into thin air. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat on my couch with my shotgun across my lap, watching my front door, hoping that whatever I had seen wouldn't come back and try to get in. I still cannot explain what I saw that night, but it raises the hair on the back of my neck every time I think about it.
Story 6. Eyes in the Wilderness.
When I was a child living in Queensland, Australia, I used to bush bash, which means walking off the beaten track through thick scrub. I knew the national park that my house backed onto like the back of my hand. I understood the topography and knew where I was at all times. Both of my parents were ex-military, and they had a hands-off approach, trusting me to venture off into the wilderness on my own, even at the age of 12. I could pack a lunch, and my sister, a neighborhood friend, would come with me. We would head off early in the morning, and we would return just before sunset, usually. One day when I was about 14, we were following creek beds and climbing over heavily forested hills towards an area I had never been before. We came down a hill through a gully full of ferns and followed a dry creek bed for another hour. The sides of the creek became steep and rocky, and before long we were passing through a gorge. As we emerged from the gorge, we noticed what looked like a dwelling. Being curious children, we wanted to investigate. At first it looked abandoned, but as we got closer, we saw that tarps had been affixed to the ramshackle structure. Chicken wire surrounded what appeared to be a pen just outside. As I scanned the area, my eyes suddenly met another pair of eyes staring directly at me. It was a Rottweiler, We slowly started to edge back away from the property, but it was too late. The dog started going wild, and, fearing it was coming after us, or possibly alerting the person or people living in the hut, we bolted. I returned to the area a few times, but never too close to the dwelling itself. During one visit, I found discarded bones from small game and other bits and pieces, as well as spent .22 caliber casings. As an adult, and now familiar with the area, I suspect we may have stumbled upon either a homeless person's camp or a methamphetamine lab. The area was well known for being riddled with illegal methamphetamine labs.
Story 7. Circled by Shadows.
During the summer in Wyoming, I was part of a team collecting data on bats and herpetofauna in remote locations, mostly Bureau of Land Management land. The work itself was exciting, but also brought its share of eerie experiences. We were far from civilization, surrounded by vast stretches of wilderness, where the sounds of nature often played tricks on the mind. I'd hear the chilling screams of mountain lions echoing through the night, the sharp snorts of deer, and what sounded like owls fighting in the trees. One morning I woke up to find 2 massive bull moose sleeping only 20 yards behind my tent, completely unaware of our presence. But none of this could have prepared me for what happened one night while we were stationed in the southwestern part of the state. It was after dark when we saw headlights in the distance, slowly approaching us across the open sagebrush. The truck had no road to follow and was coming straight at us, creeping closer and closer until it stopped about 100 yards away. The lights were turned off, and for a moment, everything went silent. Then, the shadow of a person emerged from the truck. They stepped out and began walking slowly, circling around us. We could hear the crunch of their footsteps in the dry sagebrush, their movements deliberate and unnerving. I felt my pulse quicken as they made a complete circle around our camp, remaining just out of sight, at roughly 100 yards away. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was clear they could hear us talking, but we didn't dare make any sudden moves. This was no casual passerby. The isolation of the land, the eerie silence that had descended upon the place, and the strange figure stalking around us made it feel as though we were being watched by something or someone intent on something we couldn't understand. The figure finally returned to the truck, got back in, and slowly drove away. As soon as the truck was out of sight, we packed up in haste. The tension in the air was thick, and we drove an hour to the nearest hotel, our nerves still on edge. The next day I called the office and told them, "I'm bringing a gun next time we go out. Bear mace is just not enough." I'd been on plenty of remote trips, but nothing compared to that night. Something about that figure walking in the darkness, circling our camp, still sends chills down my spine.
Story 8. The Footsteps.
One summer, I spent time doing conservation work in the middle of nowhere, Wyoming. I was part of a crew tasked with building hiking and biking trails in a remote wilderness area, a place so isolated that the nearest town, with only 41 people, was a 2-hour drive away. One night, we were in the back portion of a high-altitude desert. It was late, around 11:30 at night, and the camp was completely dark. Clouds had covered the stars, and my headlamp was likely the only light for miles. Everyone had gone to bed, but I stayed up to read. Suddenly I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, walking around our camp, heading toward the tents. My heart immediately started racing. I knew something was wrong. The person wasn't using a light, which was strange. But what really set me on edge was that the footsteps were coming from the opposite direction, away from the tents, not toward them. In the few seconds it took for me to drop my book, stand up, and turn the corner of the tent, the sound abruptly stopped. I shined my light across the camp, and there, right in front of me, were tracks in the dirt. They seemed to come from one side of the camp, circle around, pass by the sleeping tents, and then continue out again. I couldn't explain it. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked down at the tracks. They were nearly identical to my own boots, same tread, same pattern, except for one small detail. A rock was lodged in the tread of my boot, creating an imperfection in the pattern. But these tracks had no such imperfection. I was wearing US size 15 double wide boots. No one else in my crew wore boots, even close to that size, let alone the exact same tread pattern. And yet, here were the prints, as if I had walked right around the camp while everyone was asleep. I don't think any of us slept much that night. The other crew members woke up, confused and frightened, after hearing me moving around. They all came out to look at the prints, but none of us dared to step on them, choosing to step around them like cracks in the sidewalk. The next day, a light rain washed the tracks away, but the unease never fully left. We never saw or heard anything else, but the fear lingered.
Story 9. Alone in the morgue.
I used to work the graveyard shift at a medical examiner's office, alone in the dead of night. It was quiet, eerie, and unsettling, especially during those first few shifts. One night, as the clock struck midnight, the air system suddenly shut off, causing the vents to warp and creak. At first, the noise sounded like someone running through the ceiling on all fours, sending chills down my spine. The unnerving sound echoed through the silence, but over time I grew used to it. There was another night when everything went dark. I had been watching a horror movie to keep myself company, working away when, without warning, the power cut out. The entire building plunged into darkness, and the feeling of dread hit me like a cold wave. It was pitch black, and I was acutely aware of the room filled with around 30 dead bodies just down the hall. I froze, my heart pounding. I couldn't shake the thought of the dark, empty rooms and the silence that seemed to be closing in around me. I didn't even hesitate. I grabbed my things and ran to my car, staying there until the power came back on. But the eerie atmosphere didn't end there. The long, dark hallways with their dim red lights seemed to stretch on forever, adding to the sense of isolation and dread. Every shadow felt like it was watching. Every sound in the silence felt amplified. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right in those moments. Eventually, I moved on to a different shift. As much as I'd gotten used to the sounds and the dark, I'll never forget that sense of unease that hung in the air. Knowing that I was surrounded by the dead in a place where no one would hear you scream.
Story 10. The Mysterious Light.
I was working on a ship sailing through the vast and remote Alaskan waters, surrounded by nothing but darkness and endless ocean. It happened to be my first night ever witnessing the Northern Lights, and I still can't quite describe the sheer awe I felt. The sky came alive with vibrant colors, making the night appear as if it were perpetual twilight. The shimmering light stretched for miles, and we could see everything as clearly as if the day had never ended. It was breathtaking, surreal, and a moment I would never forget. Around 1 at night, a few of my buddies and I decided to head up to the Lido deck. We had to get a closer look at the lights. What began as just the two of us turned into a small crowd of 6, nearly the entire crew, gathered in silence, admiring the beauty above us. The deck felt almost sacred, a small sanctuary in the middle of the dark sea. But then something changed. Without warning, a blinding white spotlight appeared, shining directly at us from above the water. The light was too high to be coming from any ship, and we were near land, yet this light was hovering far above the water, high up in the sky. It felt otherworldly, almost deliberate in its focus. It illuminated us for about 15 to 20 seconds, the light casting eerie shadows on the deck. We stood frozen, staring, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. When the light finally disappeared, we instinctively looked around, our eyes scanning the horizon. But there was nothing, no aircraft, no vessel, no trace of anything that could explain what we just experienced. Just the vast black ocean and the silent night. The air was thick with tension as we exchanged uneasy glances. A few minutes later, as if it was somehow aware we had noticed it, the light reappeared, this time on the other side of our vessel, just above the dark silhouette of the mountains. The light flickered again for a brief moment, but this time it was too far to make out any detail. Still, we were all certain of what we had seen. There was no visible aircraft in sight, no helicopter, nothing that could explain the precision of the light's movement. We stood there, shaken and silent. The remote waters of Alaska were never quiet, but this felt different, like we had stumbled upon something we were never meant to see. None of us had ever seen anything like it, especially not so late at night in such a desolate place. We couldn't explain what it was, but we all felt the same unnerving certainty. This was no ordinary light. Some of us joked about it being a military operation, maybe a silent aircraft performing drills, but deep down, none of us could shake the feeling that we had encountered something far stranger, something that didn't belong. As the night dragged on, the northern lights continued to dance above us, but the strange light was gone, and the vastness of the ocean below felt even emptier, darker, and more foreboding than before.
Thanks for joining us on this terrifying adventure. If tonight's story gave you chills, let us know in the comments below, and share your own scary experiences too. Don't forget to leave a like if you want more nightmares, and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, sleep tight, and remember, not all shadows are empty.